The snow had been falling for 3 days straight when Deputy Hank Mercer finally got the call about a disturbance up on Ridgeline Road. It wasn't unusual for trouble to find its way into the mountains this time of year. The cold had a way of making people desperate, and desperate people did things that ended careers, ended marriages, and sometimes ended lives. Hank had seen enough of it in his 15 years with the Callaway County Sheriff's Department to know that no call was ever as simple as the dispatcher made it sound. He drove his cruiser up the winding mountain road with his wipers working overtime, the headlights cutting pale yellow tunnels through the white curtain of snow. The radio crackled with the sparse details his dispatcher had given him. A woman had been spotted at the Talbot property, a remote stretch of land owned by Cade Talbot, a man who had lived alone on that mountain for going on 7 years. A neighbor passing on the adjacent logging road had seen lights on in the cabin and what looked like 2 figures through the window. Since everyone in the county knew Cade Talbot lived alone and didn't welcome company, the neighbor had called it in. Cade Talbot was not a man people asked questions of. He stood 6'4", had shoulders like a barn door, and kept a beard that had grown somewhere between impressive and alarming. He'd moved up to the mountain after leaving what people in town called his former life, though nobody knew exactly what that life had entailed. He came into town once every 2 weeks for supplies, paid in cash, spoke to no one unless spoken to, and returned up the mountain like a ghost retreating into fog. He wasn't unfriendly, exactly. He was just sealed, like a jar someone had shut too tight and never bothered to open again. Hank pulled his cruiser up the long dirt drive, which had become a white river of snow, and parked 20 yards from the cabin. He could see the warm orange glow of firelight through the frosted window. Smoke curled from the stone chimney. He sat for a moment, engine running, watching, before he cut the ignition and stepped out into the cold. He knocked on the cabin door with his gloved fist and stood back, one hand resting near his hip out of habit, not alarm. He heard movement inside, heavy boots crossing a wooden floor, and then the door opened and Cade Talbot filled the frame the way a wall fills a room. Cade looked at Hank with those flat gray eyes that gave nothing away, the way a winter sky gives nothing away about whether the storm is coming or going. He was wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cold bleeding in through the open door, and his jaw was set in that particular way men set their jaws when they've already decided how a conversation is going to go. "Cade," Hank said by way of greeting. "Hank," Cade said by way of answering. There was a silence between them that was not entirely unfriendly. Hank had dealt with Cade a handful of times over the years. A property line dispute with a logging company 3 years back, a question about a hunting license the year before that. Cade had always been cooperative in the way that people are cooperative when they know the law and know how to stay just inside it. "Got a call about your place," Hank said. "Neighbor spotted someone up here with you, just doing a wellness check." Cade didn't move from the doorway. His expression didn't change. "I'm well," he said. "Appreciate that." Hank said, "Mind if I come in?" Something crossed Cade's face then. It was fast, almost imperceptible, but Hank had been reading faces for 15 years, and he caught it the way you catch a fish you didn't expect to be there. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was calculation, the look of a man running through options and coming up short. "My wife's here," Cade said. "She doesn't like surprises." Hank blinked. In 7 years of knowing about Cade Talbot, he had never once heard mention of a wife. No one in town had. Hank took a slow breath of cold mountain air and kept his face neutral. "Didn't know you were married, Cade." "Private matter," Cade said. "Sure," Hank said. "Still, I'd like to come in, just for a minute. make sure everything's all right. Another calculation passed behind those gray eyes. Then Cade stepped back from the door and let Hank inside. The cabin was warm and smelled of wood smoke and pine, and something cooking on the cast iron stove. It was spare but well kept, the way a man's space gets when he has only himself to account for. A rough, hewn table, 2 chairs, a cot in the corner piled with wool blankets, shelves lined with canned goods and tools, and a few paperback books with broken spines. A fire breathing orange behind the iron grate of the fireplace, and in one of the chairs at the table, wrapped in one of those wool blankets and cradling a tin mug of something hot, was a woman. She was young, maybe late 20s, with dark hair that was damp and tangled and falling across a round face that was simultaneously exhausted and weary in the way that people look when they have been frightened for a long time and have run out of adrenaline. She was a big woman, broad, shouldered, heavy, the blanket wrapped around her like a shawl over what looked like clothes that had been soaked through and were still drying. She had a cut above her left eyebrow that had been cleaned and butterflied shut with medical tape, the kind Cade probably kept in a first aid kit. Her eyes, when they moved to Hank, were dark brown and sharp and absolutely terrified, not startled, not surprised, terrified, the specific terror of someone who recognizes a uniform and does not experience it as safety. Hank kept his posture loose and easy. He took off his hat. "Evening, ma'am," he said. She said nothing. She looked at Cade. Cade had moved to stand beside the table with his arms crossed, not in a threatening way, but in the way of a man who is standing between two things and hasn't decided which one needs protecting from the other. "Like I said," Cade told Hank, his voice even, "she doesn't like surprises." "I understand that," Hank said. He looked at the woman again. "My name is Deputy Mercer. I'm with the Callaway County Sheriff's Department. Can I ask your name, ma'am?" Her jaw worked. She looked into her tin mug. Then she looked at Cade again with those dark eyes, and something passed between them that Hank could not read. A look that carried a weight that didn't make sense between two people who supposedly knew each other well enough to be married. "June," she said finally. Her voice was low and rough, like someone who had been crying or screaming or both. "June Talbot." Hank nodded slowly. He studied the cut above her eyebrow. He studied the damp clothes, now mostly dry, but still bearing the rumpled evidence of having been soaked. He studied the way her hands gripped the tin mug so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. "How'd you get that cut, June?" "Fell," she said. "Where?" "Outside," she said. "In the snow. I'm clumsy." Hank looked at Cade. Cade's expression had not changed. It was a very good mask, Hank thought, but it was a mask, and something was sitting just underneath it that was pulling at the seams. "You fall in the snow often?" Hank asked the woman. "Not usually," she said. "The ice surprised me." Hank nodded again. He was quiet for a moment, just standing in the warm room with the fire popping and the snow pressing against the windows outside. He was turning things over in his mind. Something wasn't right. The cut was consistent with a fall, but the terror in her eyes was not. You could fake a story about a fall. You couldn't fake that particular kind of fear, the deep-in, the bone kind that had settled there over time like sediment. "You two been married long?" Hank asked, directing the question at no one in particular. "Long enough," Cade said. Hank looked at the woman. "June, how long have you and Cade been married?" She hesitated for half a second too long. 3 years, she said. "Where were you married?" Another half second. "Elk County," she said. "Little courthouse there." Hank knew Elk County. He'd worked a case there once, years back. He made a note to himself. "You live up here with Cade full time." "She travels for work," Cade said. Hank looked at him. "I was asking her." Cade uncrossed his arms and then crossed them again. His jaw tightened. "Yes," June said quietly. "I travel, for work." "What kind of work?" Hank asked. She blinked. "Sales," she said. "Sales?" Hank repeated. He smiled the way he smiled when he wasn't sure yet whether to believe something. "Long way from a sales territory up here on this mountain. I was visiting," she said, "visiting Cade. It's been a while." The fire popped loudly in the silence that followed. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like the ocean. Hank put his hat back on. He thanked them both for their time. He told them to stay warm and to be careful on the ice. He looked at June one more time before he left, held her gaze for just a moment, and in that moment he tried to communicate the thing that sometimes needed communicating in these situations. Thing that couldn't be said aloud. He tried to tell her with his eyes that she could tell him the truth. That the door he was walking out of was not necessarily the last door. She looked back at him with those dark, terrified eyes and said nothing. He walked out into the snow and got into his cruiser and sat there for a long time with the engine running and the heater blowing. Then he picked up his radio and called dispatch. He gave them the name June Talbot and asked for a records check. He described her physical appearance: height, approximate weight, dark hair, dark eyes, mid to late 20s, cut above the left eyebrow. He asked them to run it and get back to him. He sat and waited. It took 11 minutes. When dispatch came back, the voice on the other end had that particular careful tone that meant something real had turned up. The name June Talbot matched nothing, but the description matched an active warrant out of Harlan County, 2 counties south, for a woman named Brenna Colt. Brenna Colt, age 27, wanted for questioning in connection with the death of her husband, Dale Colt, whose body had been found in their home 4 days ago. She'd been missing since the day of the discovery. There was also a note in the system from the Harlan County Sheriff's Office that Brenna Colt had a documented history as a victim of domestic violence, multiple hospital visits over a 2-year period, all attributed in the reports to accidents, falls, clumsiness. Hank sat with the radio in his hand and the snow coming down all around his cruiser and thought about that for a long moment. He thought about the cut above the eyebrow, and the way she'd said the word "fell like it" was a word she'd said many times before and had learned to say without flinching. He thought about Cade Talbot standing in front of her like a wall. He thought about the look that had passed between them, the look that didn't make sense between two people who knew each other well, and he reconsidered it. Maybe it made a different kind of sense. Maybe it was the look of two strangers who had come to a fast and wordless understanding about something. He radioed dispatch back and told them he was returning to the Talbot property. He asked them to notify the Harlan County Sheriff's Office that he might have a lead on their person of interest. He drove back up the drive. He knocked again. Cade answered again. This time Hank didn't wait to be invited. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. June, or Brenna, was still at the table. She hadn't moved. She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw the resignation of someone who had been running long enough to know that the running always ends. "I need you to be honest with me," Hank said. He was speaking to both of them, but looking at her. "I know your name isn't June Talbot. I have a warrant out of Harlan County for a woman named Brenna Colt, and I think that's you." The room was very quiet. The fire breathed in and out. Then Cade Talbot said, "She didn't do it." Hank looked at him. "You know her." "I met her 2 nights ago," Cade said. "She came up through the south tree line. I found her in the snow about a 1/4 mile from the cabin. She was half frozen, and she had that cut on her head and 3 cracked ribs." He paused. "She told me what happened." Hank was quiet. He looked at Brenna. She had put down the tin mug. Her hands were flat on the table. She was looking at the wood grain of the table as though reading something in it. When she finally spoke, her voice was very steady, the way things are steady when they have no energy left to shake. "I didn't kill Dale," she said. "He fell down the stairs. We were fighting and he came at me and I pushed him and he fell down the stairs." She paused. "I've been pushing him off me for 2 years. Every time I'd push back, he'd hit me harder the next time to teach me not to." She looked up. Her eyes were dry. That night he fell wrong. He just fell wrong, and then he wasn't moving. The fire popped. Outside, the snow came down. "Why did you run?" Hank asked. "Because I knew how it would look," she said. "A woman my size, they'd say I overpowered him. They always say things like that, like my body is automatically a weapon, like I couldn't possibly be the one who was afraid." Her voice didn't waver. "I've been afraid of Dale Colt every single day for 2 years. I called the police once, 14 months ago. You can look it up. The officer who responded told me to try not to provoke him." Hank looked at his hands. He thought about the note in the system. Multiple hospital visits, accidents, falls. "I can look that up," he said quietly, "and I will." "I didn't mean for him to die," she said. "I only meant for him to stop." The room was silent for a long moment. Then Cade spoke, and his voice had that low mountain steadiness in it, the voice of a man who has thought carefully before opening his mouth. "She needs a lawyer before she talks to anyone else," he said. "She's been cooperative enough." Hank looked at him for a long moment. "You sheltered a fugitive," he said. "I found a woman dead in the snow on my property," Cade said. "I brought her inside. I gave her food and warmth and first aid. I wasn't aware she was wanted. She told me her name was June." He met Hank's eyes. "That's my statement. Write it down." Hank understood then, more fully, what Cade was doing. He was drawing a legal perimeter around the woman at the table. He was using his words with the precision of someone who had, at some point in his life, learned exactly how language functioned inside the machinery of the law. Hank filed that away, another piece of Cade Talbot's sealed jar clicking into place. Hank pulled out his phone and made a call. Not to dispatch. To a lawyer named Retta Odom, who worked out of the county seat and who had a reputation for being exceptionally good at separating the complicated truth from the convenient lie in criminal proceedings. Retta answered on the third ring. Hank explained the situation in plain terms. He heard her exhale slowly on the other end. "Don't let anyone from Harlan County talk to her until I get there." Retta said. "Roads are bad." Hank said. "I have a truck," Retta said, and hung up. Hank put his phone away. He looked at Brenna Colt, who had been watching him with those dark eyes during the entire call. "I'm not going to arrest you tonight," he said. "I'm going to wait until your attorney arrives. But I need you to understand that you'll need to cooperate with the Harlan County investigation." She nodded, just once, slow and certain. "And I need you to understand something else," he said. "What you've told me tonight, the history with your husband, the previous police report, the hospital records, that matters, that's evidence. That's the kind of thing that changes the shape of a case." She looked at him with an expression that was not quite hope, because hope was too bright a thing for a face that had been through what hers had been through. It was something more cautious than hope, the first small movement toward it. "All right," she said. Hank sat down in the empty chair and settled in to wait. Cade went to the stove and put a pot of coffee on. He poured 3 cups when it was ready and set one in front of Hank, without asking, and one in front of Brenna, and kept one for himself. He sat in the corner on a low stool with his long arms resting on his knees and looked at the fire, and none of the 3 of them spoke for a while. The snow kept falling, the fire kept breathing, the mountain kept being what mountains are, indifferent and ancient and very still. At some point, Hank found himself asking Cade the question he'd been turning over. since he first heard the man claim a wife he'd never mentioned in 7 years. "You didn't actually know her," Hank said, "but you lied for her." Cade kept looking at the fire. "I said she was my wife," he said. "That was a lie. Everything else I said was true." Hank thought about that. "Why," he asked, "why stick your neck out for a stranger?" Cade was quiet for so long that Hank thought he might not answer at all. Then he said, "I found her in the snow, in the dark. She was trying to crawl." He paused. The only reason a person crawls through the snow in the dark on a mountain they don't know is because whatever they're running from is worse than freezing to death. He looked at his coffee cup. "I've known that kind of calculus, not personally, but I've known people who have made it." He didn't elaborate, and Hank didn't press. Retta Odom arrived 2 hours and 20 minutes later, stomping snow off her boots in the doorway of the cabin. A small, fierce woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head an briefcase she'd carried up from her truck without any apparent difficulty. She assessed the room in about 4 seconds, poured herself the last of the coffee without asking, sat down across from Brenna Colt, and said, "Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out. And if anyone else tries to talk to you before I say so." She glanced at Hank. "That includes law enforcement. That includes Harlan County. That includes anyone who isn't me. You look at them and you say, 'My attorney is present and I have nothing to say.'" Brenna Colt looked at the woman, and something happened in her face that Hank had not seen there since he'd walked through the door. The tightly held thing in her jaw released, just fractionally, like a knot loosening one turn. "Okay," she said. "Good," Retta said. "Now talk." Hank stepped outside to give them privacy and stood on the porch in the cold with his coffee and the snow falling straight down around him in the windless dark. He called the Harlan County Sheriff's Office and spoke with the lead investigator on the Dale Colt case, a man named Fredericks, who had the clipped manner of someone overworked and under-resourced. Hank told him that the person of interest had been located, that she had legal representation, and that she would be available for a formal interview once her attorney was satisfied. He mentioned, carefully, the prior domestic violence report on file. He mentioned the hospital records. He mentioned that the investigative record might benefit from a thorough review before anyone started talking about charges. Fredericks was quiet for a moment. Then he said he'd have someone pull the file in the morning. Hank said that sounded wise. He hung up and stood in the dark and drank his cold coffee and looked out at the snow-covered mountain, the dark shapes of the pines heavy with white, the sky a gray, black dome with no stars behind the cloud cover. He thought about how many times over his career he had walked into a situation that looked one way from the outside and revealed itself to be something else entirely from the inside. He thought about how the same story could be told from 2 different positions and produce 2 entirely different accounts of who was afraid and who was dangerous and who was running and who was chasing. After a while, the door opened behind him, and Cade stepped out and stood beside him on the narrow porch, his breath fogging in the cold. The 2 men stood there together without speaking for several minutes, in the way that men who are not particularly close, but who have arrived at a point of mutual understanding, sometimes stand. "What did you do before you came up here?" Hank asked. "Before the mountain." Cade was quiet. "Law," he said. "Not practiced it, studied it, used it." A pause. "Worked for a firm for 8 years. Different kind of law than what you do, corporate, but I learned how language works inside it." Hank nodded slowly. "That answered some things. Why'd you leave?" Cade looked at the snow. "Because I spent 8 years learning how language works inside the law," he said, "and somewhere in there I stopped being able to tell if it was being used for justice or just for winning." He paused again. "I needed someplace quiet to figure out the difference." Hank thought that was probably the most words Cade Talbot had said in sequence to another human being in a very long time. "You figured it out?" Hank asked. Cade almost smiled. "Not quite. Still working on it." He said. They went back inside. The case took 4 months to work its way through the system. The medical examiner in Harlan County reviewed the evidence with fresh eyes once the prior documentation of abuse was formally entered into the record. The hospital visits spanning 2 years, the old police report, and crucially, the autopsy findings, which were consistent with an accidental fall and were not consistent with the kind of deliberate force the initial theory of the case had presumed. Retta Odom was present at every proceeding, steady and precise and ferocious in the way that small people are sometimes more ferocious than large ones. Brenna Colt was never charged. The Harlan County DA office issued a formal statement indicating that the investigation had concluded and that the death of Dale Colt had been ruled an accidental fall following a domestic altercation in which the decedent was the aggressor. It was careful, measured language, but it was language, and it was in the record, and it meant something. Hank heard about the conclusion from Retta, who called him on a Tuesday afternoon in April when the snow was finally gone from the lower elevations and the mountain roads were passable again. "She's free," Retta said simply. "Thought you'd want to know." He did want to know. He said as much. "She asked me to thank you," Retta said, "for how you handled it that night." Hank thought about the cold cabin and the fire and the 3 tin cups of coffee. "I just did my job," he said. "You did it the right way," Retta said. "That's not as common as you might hope." He didn't hear anything about Brenna Colt for several more weeks after that. Then, on a morning in late May, when he was coming out of the diner on Main Street with a paper bag of breakfast, he saw her on the sidewalk. She was standing in front of the hardware store next door, studying something in the window display. Her dark hair was clean and loose around her face, and she was wearing a light jacket, and she did not look like someone who had been crawling through the snow in the dark. She looked like someone who had made it to somewhere and was considering what to do next. She noticed him and straightened up, and for a moment that old wariness moved across her face, the reflex of a person who has learned to read uniforms as threats. Then it passed, and she gave him a small, careful nod. He nodded back. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. He kept walking. He figured whatever she was doing next was her own business and nobody else's, and that was probably the way it should be. Sometime in late June, he was told by the woman at the county clerk's office, who told everyone everything, that Cade Talbot had come down from his mountain and signed a lease on the small commercial space on the corner of 3rd and Mill, which had been empty for 2 years.